Let us pray. From our forests and parkland to our prairies and mountains comes the call of our land. From our farmsteads, towns, and cities comes the call of our people, that as legislators of this province, we act with responsibility and sensitivity. Lord, grant us the wisdom to meet such challenges. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table with the Assembly the annual report for the Public Service Commissioner for the year 1986.
Minister of Energy.
Speaker, I'd like to table the annual report of the Department of Energy ending March 31st, 1986.
Introduction of special guests.
Special guest, the member for Redwater, Andrew.
Speaker, since this is a forestry week, I would like to thank the Minister for the pine that's been sent to all our offices, which comes out of Pine Ridge Forest Nursery in the Redwater Andrew constituency near Smoky Lake. And Smoky Lake was the forestry capital of Canada in 1982. Seated in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, to celebrate this occasion, we have two special guests, the Mayor of Smoky Lake, Mr. Ernie Brusso, and the Secretary-Treasurer of Smoky Lake, Mr. Elmer O'Shan. And I would thank them for coming to help us celebrate this occasion and ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Member for Rocky Mountain House.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today, on behalf of my very good friend and colleague, the member for Chinook, to introduce to you and through you to the Assembly 22 students from grade 9 Consort School. They're accompanied by two teachers, Mr. Kiersgaard and Miss Verrigan, and also two parents, Mrs. Gould and Mrs. Williams. They're seated in the members' gallery and asked them to rise and receive the welcome of the Assembly.
Edmonton Gold Bar, followed by Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning I'm honored to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly 28 students from the grade 6 class of St. Gabriel School in the beautiful constituency of Edmonton Gold Bar. The class are accompanied by Mrs. Barry, their teacher, and Mrs. Blesnick, their bus driver. They're seated in the public gallery. I'll ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of this Assembly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to introduce today my nephew, Kevin McEachran, who is in town for a hockey school. I would like the Assembly to give him a warm welcome.
Member for... Chair's gone blank today.
Too many of us getting up to introduce
Glengarry.
people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I take great pride in introducing to you and through you to members of the Assembly 52 grade 6 students from Bishop Saverin School in the riding of Glengarry. When I get a chance to meet such delightful students, it makes me a little homesick for my previous occupation, and I realize how much I did enjoy it. They're accompanied by 3 teachers, Mr. Gary Marler, Mr. Larry Kowalczyk, and Mrs. Rose Auger. I would like them to rise in the members and public gallery and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today it is my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to the members of this Assembly 24 students from the grade 6 class at the Brookwood Elementary School in Spruce Grove, the school that our 2 children attended. They are accompanied by their teacher, Mrs. Beth Willett, and one parent, Mrs. Dorsch. They are seated in the public gallery, and I ask that they rise and receive the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly.
Ministerial statements.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to announce to this Legislative Assembly that tomorrow, Saturday, May the 2nd, 1987, thousands of energetic young Albertans will take to the province's highways during the annual 4-H cleanup campaign. Mr. Speaker, this campaign, now in its 11th year, has progressed to the point that last year almost 64,000 bags of litter were gathered from along 8,500 kilometers of Alberta highways. Tomorrow, we expect to surpass those numbers as more than 9,000 young people from Alberta's 4-H clubs and junior forest wardens, along with several thousand adult supervisors, do their best to keep Alberta beautiful. While these dedicated workers are doing their share, the rest of us have a very important part to play as well. We must drive with extra care and caution wherever we see these youngsters working. While many of our volunteers are young adults, others are still quite young and can be unpredictable around traffic, especially with the activity generated during a cleanup campaign. I ask all motorists to slow down and obey signs when they come upon a cleanup site. Alberta Transportation and Utilities has taken several steps to ensure the safety of these workers. They will be dressed in bright clothing with orange safety vests and will be using orange litter bags. The area where the work is taking place will be well signed, and the RCMP will provide additional support. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the department has also organized a province-wide advertising campaign designed to make motorists aware of the cleanup. These volunteers are performing a very valuable service for all Albertans, and I take this opportunity to publicly acknowledge their outstanding effort. I am certain that all my fellow members join me in wishing them a safe and successful cleanup campaign.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to agree with the government from time to time, and certainly we in the official opposition support this very worthwhile project. I've seen the work that's happened in the past 11 years, and it's very worthwhile. So I would just like to join with the government in congratulating these young people and taking their civic duty so seriously. And I, like the Minister, hope that motorists are aware and that we don't have a tragedy out of this. So I would just conclude and with the government congratulate these young people and thank the government for bringing this project forward.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that we are recognizing National Forest Week, May 3rd to May 9th. This year's theme, Forest, a Shared Resource, was chosen to emphasize the shared usage of Alberta's forests and the multitude of activities and products that we derive from them. A year ago, this government gave a firm commitment to increase the value of our forest products output, to create new jobs, and further diversify Alberta's economy. A new thrust in forestry was announced by the new government. Over a dozen new projects are underway or completed, over 1,100 direct jobs have been created, over $700 million have been invested by industry, and many more projects are under consideration. Meanwhile, our resource base has more than doubled in capacity through the improved management techniques and the introduction of aspen as a reliable and market-accepted wood fiber. The forests are a shared resource. The Bighorn Wildland Recreation Area, over 980,000 acres, has been established to preserve recreational values and wildlife habitat, which shows Alberta believes in this year's theme, Forest, a Shared Resource. Recently, the government announced the establishment of the Beehive Natural Area, 26 square miles of old-growth forest, a living museum to be enjoyed by future generations. Many activities are planned during next week. I invite all Albertans to participate. Grand Prairie will host the Northern Alberta Forestry Show on May 7th to May 9th. Edmonton will also host a wide variety of forest-related activities during the National Forest Week. An Arbor Day tree planting ceremony will be held on May 8th at the Matart Conservatory with the Federal Minister of Forestry, the Honourable Gerald Merthew, in attendance. This year, the Alberta Forestry Association has announced Edson as Alberta's Provincial Forest Centre for 1987. National Forest Week is a time for all of us to reflect on how fortunate we are to have such an abundance of healthy and productive forests. I encourage members of the Assembly to take the opportunity to participate in the National Forest Week activities and promote Alberta's very important forest resources within their constituencies. The Pine Ridge Nursery has provided each member of the legislature with a spruce seedling. These seedlings are being delivered to each MLA's office. Mr. Speaker, with your prior approval, samples have been placed on the clerk's table. Also, information relating to Alberta Forest Management and lapel pins from Alberta Forest Service have been placed on each MLA's desk. The nursery is capable of producing some 38 million seedlings per year, predominantly white spruce, lodgepole pine, which is our provincial tree. These seedlings are planted throughout the province to ensure that future generations will enjoy healthy, young, and vibrant forests. We invite you to plant a tree during Forestry Week. We will continue to plant more trees than we cut. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm hardly going to disagree with the announcement about National Forest Week from May 3rd to 9th, and I, along with the government, agree that there is great potential, I think, for much more diversification with this industry. I have, though, a couple of cautions, and we talk about the forests are a shared resource. Very much I agree with that. It seems to many people, though, that we've overemphasized the development of the forest rather than the recreational value of the forest, and I talk about the Eastern Slopes policy, because many people come to Alberta in the tourism industry simply because of the natural beauty of the province. I also, of course, and my colleague has raised this many times, caution about a headlong rush into herbicides, because again, that can destroy, I believe, rather quickly some of the shared resource of the forest. I would like to just comment briefly about Pine Ridge Nursery and compliment both the government and the people who work there. I've taken a tour of that particular nursery, and I believe they're doing excellent, excellent work. And I would suggest to all members, if they haven't been out there, it would be well worth the tour. I think the future is in types of industries like that and the work that they're doing. Thank you.
Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, so much for being positive. I was going to break out in a rash if I continued. Mr. Speaker, to the provincial treasurer, I notice that the government has established a task force which will reassess the whole range of taxes on business. But for some strange reason, the provincial treasurer, who is responsible to the House for fiscal policy matters, was omitted from yesterday's announcement. But my question to the treasurer, will the treasurer explain why the government is prepared to launch a full review of the fairness of the taxation system to big business while it has introduced a budget which is remarkable and it's on fairness to average Albertans.
Mr. Speaker, it's hard to enter that particular discussion because, of course, as all honourable members are aware, he opens not just the narrow element of his question, but the full debate about the fiscal policy of the government. And there is, I think, Mr. Speaker, ample opportunity in this House to deal with all of those, whether it's in discussion of the estimates, discussion of the appropriation bills, or, for that matter, in the speeches on the general resolution. So, Mr. Speaker, what is encompassed in the member's question, of course, is not just one that can be answered specifically. I'd be glad to go on in some detail to either recite the elements of the budget, but I know the uneasiness which the Speaker feels when I do that. I will, on this morning, Mr. Speaker, simply ask for more directions how I can respond.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we'll certainly give the Treasurer ample opportunity to respond. As the Minister is well aware, I've been trying to point out to this government that the corporate income tax base of this province has been eroded steadily by a series of tax reductions, credits, allowances, rebates. To last year, we paid out more than we took in. My question is, now that the corporate income tax has been eroded in this province, is the government preparing to do the same thing with property taxes paid by corporations?
Mr. Speaker, the elements of those revenue items which are included in the calculation of income tax have in fact reduced in this province over the past 2 years. I don't think you have to be a financial genius or an economist of great repute to understand what has happened when you see the devastation which has been wreaked upon the energy industry, in part by centralist policies, socialist policies in particular, and in part by economic forces. It must be a simple conclusion to decide that, of course, if the income is down of a corporation, obviously the taxable income will be down. Yet we are doing an awful lot in this province to ensure that that fundamental base of revenues to our province, which, by way of historical perspective, Mr. Speaker, in 1984-85, the province of Alberta collected approximately 25% of the total corporate tax paid in Canada. We relish and cherish the investment opportunities that those corporations bring to this province. They have done a significant amount to generate new jobs, new investment, and new economic activity. Mr. Speaker, they have to have an opportunity to do that. And that opportunity, Mr. Speaker, comes from a set of policies which supports the private sector, which rewards investment, which rewards success, and which provides a climate for that kind of activity. Mr. Speaker, it is clear right across Canada and in all the European markets, North American markets as well, that Alberta is that center where that economic regime exists, where that tax package is in place to support investment, and we know that with the price coming back and the price of energy in particular, that will return to this province very soon. We intend to make it happen. We have shown our determination to generate that kind of new investment, and it will come, Mr. Speaker. We don't want to hear from the doomsayers across the way who deny that opportunity for this province.
Mr. As usual, he's getting warmed up now. He's given us the claptrap that we're used to when we ask questions, Mr. Speaker. I would remind this minister that Alberta corporate income tax system paid out $26 million more than it took in last year. So somebody has to pay the taxes. At the same time, we had a lowered growth rate. So that just makes a mockery out of what the Treasurer is saying. And I'm saying to the Treasurer, isn't it time that the government set up a task force on the fairness of the taxation system for average people rather than worrying about their corporate friends?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the public knows who it is that has engendered mockery upon this Parliament. It is right across the way at Edmonton, Norway. No question, Mr. Speaker, about it, that if we had the socialist regime driving the economic performance of this province, that investment would flee, new jobs would be ended, and the economic growth which this province needs would be eliminated, Mr. Speaker. That's the kind of...
Perhaps now that the chair can hear what's happening, the minister would like to continue with his response.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, as I've said earlier, this budget does provide for additional increases in the corporate tax rate for large corporations. Some 36% increase in the rate structure is attempt to balance the equity between the additional tax increases on the individual and the tax increases on the corporations. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have found in our analysis and the review of the economic policies which have been provided to the people of Alberta over the past 10 or 15 years that, in fact, it is the small corporation that generates jobs, and it is that sector of our economy, the private sector of our economy, that we would like to see expand and generate new opportunities. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, this tax regime does not include any income tax increases for the small businessman. That small businessman who has arranged himself under the private corporate status does not have any increase in his taxation. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we think that's a fair balance, because we do recognize that the new investment, the new job opportunities, and the new opportunities for economic growth will come from that sector. Mr. Speaker, it's clear now that the people of Alberta accept this as a balanced position, and any negatives that come from across the way really is an unfortunate statement and will, in fact, detract from new capital investment in this province. And if that's what the member wants, that's what will happen, and it'll be his responsibility.
Fair balance of question and answer. Final supplementary, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's always interesting to hear from the Treasurer about all the new jobs that were created, but we're always wondering why we have the highest unemployment. Even in his budget, he says it's going to go up.
Yeah.
All that investment that's coming in.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, though, to the Minister of Economic Development and Trade, the Minister has said that this task force was created because they asked us to look at their tax load. Isn't that nice? Now, average Albertans want the government to look at their tax load.
Right.
My question is, will the minister explain why some people get this type of action out of the government while others cannot?
Mr. Speaker, one of the key aspects of the Alberta economy and the efforts that we've undertaken to expand job creation opportunities is to ensure that there is an environment in Alberta in which people are prepared to invest and create job opportunities. And a major part of the activity that takes place in Alberta is related to a variety of industrial activities, the petrochemical industry, manufacturing. And in Alberta, Mr. Speaker, there is a machinery and equipment tax that is charged. Alberta is only one of two provinces that levies a machinery and equipment tax. After consultation with my colleagues, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and the Minister of Education, we felt that it would be useful to examine the impact of the machinery and equipment tax on investment in Alberta and job creation, but it would be unfair to examine that tax in isolation of others, because we believe that it's important, Mr. Speaker, that Alberta continue to have a favorable environment in which to attract investment. The purpose of the task force, Mr. Speaker, is to provide us with information and advice to ensure that that environment continues to exist in Alberta.
Clark Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, back to the Treasurer. In line that we want to make sure we are not losing any corporation taxes, Mr. Speaker, could I ask the Minister, the Treasurer, whether he has examined the proposed Dome deal to see whether there will be any corporation taxes that be owing from the past that will not be paid, or any corporation taxes that would normally have been paid, sold to someone else, that will be hidden by being sold to Amico. Are we going to lose money on that deal?
The Honourable Minister, that will have to be a separate issue. That's not a follow-through on...
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
The Chair will recognize the member at the end of question period. Further supplementaries on this issue? Clover Bar.
Speaker, the Honourable Minister of Economic Development. Is the Minister of Economic Development aware that on the machinery and equipment tax that communities like Fort Saskatchewan have already taken a 5%, 5%, 5% rollback? And the question to the Minister is the government looking at some type of shielding for the community is going to be very, very adversely affected if that machinery and equipment tax is removed?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think it would be appropriate to prejudge the deliberations of the task force. The task force's objective is to provide us with information. We recognize, Mr. Speaker, that municipalities depend upon municipal taxation sources, whether it's machinery and equipment tax or the regular assessment on buildings. And this is a factor that would have to be taken into account prior to any decision being made by the government to change any of the systems. And I'd like to make it clear that simply undertaking this assessment, which is appropriate at this time, doesn't necessarily mean that changes will take place in the system.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition, followed by the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my second question to the member from Athabasca-Lac-La-Biche.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Economic Development. 1 year ago, during the provincial general election, the government used the provincial treasury to supplement its campaign platform with many promises of new initiative to diversify Alberta's economy. I would like to ask some questions this morning on policies of two government departments which have worked to frustrate attempts by many Albertans to achieve diversification of their local economy. Now, regional economic development councils in Alberta and small power producers can be very successful in harnessing the energies of small businessmen in rural Alberta in diversifying rural economy. Would the minister confirm that his department is planning in terminating or in greatly reducing financial assistance to local REDCs during the next 2 fiscal years?
Mr. Speaker, the preamble was quite extensive, and I have difficulty relating the early part of the preamble to the final part of the question. And my colleague, the Minister of Transportation and Utilities, may wish to comment on the early part of the preamble with respect to our policy on small power producers and the establishment of a process that he has put in place recently. With respect to our regional economic development boards, when those entities were established and funded, I believe some 8 years ago, it was clear at the time that when the funding was advanced that it was on an interim basis to provide initial support to the communities to establish a capability in those communities to harness their own energies in encouraging economic development. When my predecessor announced the program as Minister of Small Business, he advised all of those communities that the program was temporary, that the program would be sunsetted. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it should have been sunsetted 4 years ago. And in light of that earlier understanding, I have provided notice to the 8 regional economic development projects that their funding will be reduced in the current year and terminated the following year.
I find your answer to be very hypocritical in the attempt of the government to diversify the economy. What alternative funding would the minister make available to municipalities in order to help their REDCs continue to operate in the same level or higher level so that they can maintain diversification?
Mr. Speaker, it's obvious the honourable member didn't listen to my answer. I don't think it's appropriate to use those sorts of expressions. It is certainly not hypocritical when the individuals and the communities involved were given notice some 5 years ago that the program would be phased out. I fail to understand how the honourable member reaches that conclusion. Now, with respect to economic development approach of the government and support to the municipalities, my estimates, I believe, will be dealt with on Monday. I'd be pleased to discuss it at that time.
To the Minister of Transportation and Utilities, the government response to a 5-year attempt for grid access by small producers have been answered in a typical fashion with a 1-year-long study. Has the Minister's Department assessed what impact the decision to delay diversification into small power by another year will have on Athabasca and other local economies?
Mr. Speaker, The question is such that I'm not sure what, in essence, we're dealing with. First of all, use the Athabasca project, if I may, in responding. After becoming the Minister of Transportation and Utilities in about September of last year, I called the proponents in Athabasca and suggested that we should get together to clear up what appeared to be some misunderstandings, that I wasn't doing something or someone wasn't doing something. In the interim, in working with the Small Power Producers Association, we have put in place the public inquiry, and I use the term inquiry in the sense not public hearing, public inquiry, so that the PUB and the ERCB jointly can hold a public inquiry and make recommendations to me as minister as to, one, what is a small power producer, the types and size of generators, the number of types and capacities, their total capacity that could be interconnected without negatively impacting on the reliability of the present system, the principles and methods, and the process that should be established. Well, that was right at the end of March, early part of April, Mr. Speaker. The Athabasca project is one that is of some concern to me because some time has gone by since the first initial discussion of any public importance was in, I believe, May of last year, and we have yet to date to have an application from the proponents of the project. We're waiting, and the PUB and the ERCB are waiting, and I had a meeting this morning with 4 of the persons who were working for the plant. Up until yesterday, I believe the company laid off some people yesterday, and I indicated to them that we were still waiting for a proposal and that it was not, and I underline the word not, the government holding anything up at this point. The proponents have to come forward to us and to the PUB and ERCB, and until they do, I can't respond.
Okay, that's fine. I understand what's happening, but what the Southview Fibre Tech wanted to have from the minister and the government is a written expression of support. Now, would the minister be willing to give to this company a written letter of support so that this project and investors will maintain their interest and re-employ the 30 people that are being laid off?
Mr. Speaker, if I had some idea what the written letter of support was for, I might entertain attempting to put that in place. But until something comes from them, I can't support a shadow.
Supplementary, Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Economic Development, has the Minister taken the time to evaluate the success of these boards, or is this decision to cut their funding simply a superficial cost-cutting initiative which bears no relationship to the positive contribution that boards like these make to future economic development in areas other than energy and agricultural areas where we have to find ways of diversifying our economy?
Mr. Speaker, yes. There has been a series of examinations of the effectiveness of the 8 regional economic development boards. Some have been more effective than others, and we've worked closely with the individuals involved in the communities. And the decision was a difficult one, but it was based on the understanding that there would be a phase-out, and also the fact that there's a certain level of unfairness in providing that support to 8 groups of communities and not to another 15 that have requested it. One of the recent initiatives, Mr. Speaker, of the government, the Business Incubator Project, which I announced about 3 or 4 weeks ago, is an important element that will, to a great extent, provide additional support for all communities in Alberta, not just those that have access to the Regional Economic Development Program. Also, we have strengthened our small business sector in terms of liaising with all of the communities and not just the 8 that are funded partially by this program.
Main question, Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my first question to the member for Edmonton-Goulburn.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Social Services. The Deputy Minister of Social Services has announced his intention to leave the civil service shortly. As we have seen, Mr. Speaker, very few deputy ministerial positions are openly advertised, contrary to the Labour Minister's comments of last month. and to date, no deputy ministerial positions are filled by women. To the Minister, will the position be openly advertised and above board, or are we to have another vacancy filled by direct appointment, as we have been 7 of the last 10 deputy ministers since 1985?
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honourable member and all honourable members of the Assembly that I will do my very best to assure, especially the people of Alberta who are being served by this department, that they will also be served by another very competent deputy minister, and I will leave no stone unturned in seeing that that is accomplished.
Didn't answer.
Well, not too helpful there, Mr. Speaker. At this point, the score is 27 men and 0 women. Will the minister assure the House that her department will actively seek out competent women to apply for the position? After all, if we don't seek them, Mr. Speaker, they're going to be turned off by this government's chauvinistic attitude.
Mr. Speaker, the last time I looked, the minister was female and certainly would be encouraged.
That's what frightens us.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, that's a very attractive sidestep. Mr. Speaker, my next supplementary is to the Minister of Labour. Last month, the Minister told the House that positions are open on an equal basis to women, yet we still, of course, have no female deputy ministers. Will the Minister consider asking his colleagues to put in place a proactive search process that would seek out competent women for deputy ministerial and senior management positions? Proactive, not reactive.
Last time I looked in the mirror for the benefit of that gentleman, I was male.
We're not sure what he is.
No, Mr. Speaker, no comments of that nature. Perhaps I should add that when I wear my national dress, I have not changed my sex, Mr. Speaker. The situation is that we will assure Albertans, as the Minister has stated, that we will appoint an extremely competent individual if, and I hope that applicants will come from both sexes, if the most suitable applicant is a woman, then obviously we would appoint that person to the post. On the other hand, if that is not the case, I don't think that Albertans are best served by appointing somebody because they are female rather than because of ability.
That's a hairy one. Isn't it?
Hopeless answers. Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Advanced Education, let's try another department. I understand that your department will also have a deputy ministerial opening very shortly. Will this minister, in the absence of any commitment elsewhere, will this minister assure the House that his department will hold an open competition in order to allow the best candidate, male or female, to win out?
Mr. Speaker, I certainly have no problem in giving the honourable member assurance that the best possible person will be sought out and appointed, notwithstanding sex.
Edmonton Calder, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Social Services, in reference to her Deputy Minister's resignation, will the Minister guarantee that this senior former member of the department, architect of the move to privatization, will not receive any contracts with the government for the next 2 years, and in particular overseeing the contract of the Work for Welfare program?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what's in the honourable member's mind with respect to restricting people in other occupations. But with respect to the policy within our department and all government departments, that the most competent people who have demonstrated expertise in various areas that may be required that expertise is sought after. And, Mr. Speaker, I would only guarantee that it would be done in the fairest way possible.
Leader of the Representative Party, followed by the member for Edmonton Glengarry.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Social Services. It's relative to child welfare and responsibility for adoption and guardianship of Native children on our Indian reserves. The Minister has said that the child welfare is, and I quote, a bloody disaster in dealing with Natives. Could the Minister indicate what immediate step then is being taken to remedy that situation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the process is ongoing. I think that it is fairly widely known that the department is working with the Native community across the province and has succeeded in the last number of years and particularly of late in entering into agreements with the various communities so that they may have more opportunity to guide, in particular, the child welfare policies and specifically with respect to children that would be from their own areas.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary. Could the Minister indicate how many Indian bands have now made agreement with the department in terms of child welfare cases?
Mr. Speaker, there are, I believe, 3 such agreements, and there are a number of bands encompassed under those various agreements. The last one was with the Yellowhead Council, and I believe there were 5 bands involved in that.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister. Could the Minister indicate whether there will be a further transfer of responsibilities that are now under the jurisdiction of the Provincial Department of Social Services to the various Indian bands in terms of, say, guardianship or adoption processes?
Well, Mr. Speaker, to answer the honourable member's question without giving some sort of legal interpretation of the Child Welfare Act, it would certainly be our intention, where it is possible to, and legally possible, to delegate responsibility so that there is a more direct involvement by our Native people.
Mr. Speaker, final supplementary. Could the Minister indicate what the department will be doing in this process to ensure that the interest of the child, the Native child, that may now be in white homes or in Native homes, will be paramount over the consideration of just moving the Native child back onto the reserve or to the responsibility for to Native grandparents or parents or relatives for adoption or guardianship?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member raises probably the toughest question of all for those who care very much about the ultimate results of the decisions that they must make with respect to the children. And as always, while we want very much for the Native children to be raised where their heritage and the concern of their families is paramount, in some instances this is not possible, and foster parents who have been providing just extremely good service for children and guidance in their homes over the course of a number of years, of course, become very attached to the children and believe that they're in the best position to serve the children's interests. And often, unfortunately, judgments are different with respect to the various people that are involved, and these cases end up before the courts. And I'm sure it is very difficult in those instances as well for the judges to render a decision, because after all, it is in all cases ends up to be opinions of various people. And I can only assure the honourable member that the people who are working in that area are trying to exercise the very best judgment possible.
To Edmonton Calder, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, what steps has the department taken to ensure that Native people are trained as social workers and that they are able to remain on the reserve and work with Native children?
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the honourable member will recall that last year that we announced a bursary program for Native people. A number have now accessed that. As a matter of fact, I met a couple of them at the signing of the Yellowhead Tribal Agreement, and they're very excited about the opportunities that are being presented to them, and I'm sure they will be serving their communities when they're finished their education.
Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Supplementary to the Minister. Will the Minister undertake to provide a continuous backup of consultants to the Native services, the psychologists, psychiatrists, healthcare professionals that are necessary so that the service, this very positive development, will be supported and won't be isolated from the whole of childcare?
Mr. Speaker, our services certainly will be available to the Native community, but I would say this, with some hesitation, that over the past number of years, for quite a few years, we have been heavily involved with the Native community, and I think that most people will be aware of the results of that. The very largest number of children in various areas that government is interested in, and whether it's in the juvenile area, whether it's the child welfare area with respect to my own department, that the Native children form the major component of those caseloads. Obviously, all of our expertise that has been brought to bear for many, many years with the very best of intentions has not resulted in the kind of long-term benefits for Native children that we would have liked to have seen. And while I think it is important to consider the outlook of the professionals, the caring professionals in this area, who do have the academic expertise in particular, I think we must recognize that having had all of that applied, it hasn't always worked. I would be looking for some very practical demonstration of what might be done, and to that end, Alberta is taking a lead in hosting an international conference this fall, for instance, and certainly I'd invite honourable members to pay very close attention to that conference, to the kind of experiences from various Native and Aboriginal communities that will be shared there.
Member for Edmonton Glengarry, followed by the member for Edmonton Meadowlark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After thanking the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife for his kind gift this morning, I'd like to address the problem that this week he's made several statements that indicate he's not really aware of what's happening in his department where the use and safety of herbicides is concerned. He mentioned that forestry is a shared resource, and I'd like to point out it's hard for wildlife to share a chemically sprayed forest or for fish to live in creeks which receive the chemical runoff. Assuming that he's had time to read the advertisement I sent him the other day, can the Minister outline how many more acres of brush the Forestry, Lands and Wildlife Department plans to aerial spray, and whether or not it will intervene and hold public meetings before those sprays occur?
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to address the issue. The advertisement you handed me the other day is very misleading of you to do that. The grazing reserve program in this province has been very, very well accepted. We have some 31 of them throughout the provinces. Some 1,500 farmers use those grazing reserves, and they use the management tools on those grazing reserves, which are primarily in the white zone, to take care of the growth of grasses and or trees, and spraying does take place like on any other agricultural area. We do have a very rigid process when it comes to spraying of our forests and our forestry programs. And if you want to add in and stop all of the farmers in this province, along with those farmers on those grazing reserves, from having the opportunity to maintain those grazing reserves from the use they have, that's a different issue. And if you, I think it's once and for all, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask my colleague, the Minister of Environment, to explain his very, very rigid process that he makes me and my department go through if I want to spray in the forests of this province.
The chair gets dirty looks from all around the chamber, but I guess that's probably the way I look in the mirror. I invite those kind of looks, but the chair is also hearing agreed and no and groan and all the rest of it, and therefore the chair will recognize Edmonton Glengarry, and perhaps he would like to speak directly to the Minister of the Environment.
On this, I would prefer, Mr. Speaker, to address the Minister of Forestry, Lands and Wildlife on his admission that his department has ordered hexazinone and other chemicals from DuPont. He admitted that in the House. And I'm wondering if he will give the names of other chemicals and the quantities of them ordered, or at least commit himself to tabling that information in the legislature.
Surely this is motion for return, honourable member. Next question, please.
I will use that avenue then. Thank you. Concerning the minister's blind faith in federal licensing procedures, does the minister accept Agriculture Canada's policy of registering herbicides on the basis of tests paid for or done by chemical companies or labs such as industrial biotest labs? Or will he approach Agriculture Canada and express his opinions otherwise?
Mr. Speaker, this government has a very rigid process in accepting chemicals. The chemicals being used, that were used last year, are Valpar and primarily Roundup. And as I stated earlier, my department on all applications have to apply to the Minister of Environment and to have approval of the type of chemical and the location that we are going to spray or use that chemical in. This year we are not planning on in the forestry areas, any aerial spraying. They will all primarily be ground applications, and most of them will be very definitely tied to an experimental base to prove that we have the technology that we need in the future years. I again would, as far as the approval of chemicals, I'd turn that question over to my colleague, the Minister of Environment.
Perhaps, Mr. Speaker, I could just supplement that response. The question being raised by the member from Glengarry this morning was a question of should a proponent of a particular chemical have to pay for the research, or should it be the taxpayer of the country who pays for the research? In October 2 of 1986, when I served as the president of the Canadian Council of Resource and Environment Ministers, all ministers of the environment across the country of Canada, including the federal minister of the environment, supported a concept put forward as the cradle-to-grave concept with respect to chemicals. This simply means that if someone wishes to come and have for usage in our country a particular chemical, we are now requiring and requesting that that particular proponent show to us how that particular chemical will be used, etc., and finally how that chemical will be disposed of at the end. We expect that the proponent or the entrepreneur that wants to have that chemical for license in Canada should bear the costs of that, not the taxpayer of the country.
In the House this week, the Minister of Forestry said their rigid method is to do whatever Agriculture Canada says, and they in turn do whatever the chemical companies say. That doesn't sound very rigid. Now, in view of the number of chemicals that predate registration standards or do not meet the most recent standards, does the Minister of Environment then accept the principle that such chemicals should be deregistered until they are sufficiently tested and proven to at least meet present standards?
Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no information ever brought to my attention that Agricultural Canada is simply a mouthpiece for the chemical industry in this country. Quite frankly, it's my understanding that when chemicals are brought forward to Agricultural Canada for review, that particular federal agency, department of the federal government, scrutinizes the potential usage of that particular chemical in our country, and there's a very rigid testing procedure that is followed. And the province of Alberta, in the same way that other provinces in this country provide the usage and afford the usage of that particular chemical in the particular provincial jurisdiction if it has been approved by the federal regulatory agency.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Supplementary, if I may, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Environment, back to the original of spraying on public lands. Does the minister require any form of permit, or does he keep track of the amount of chemicals that are used by municipalities and utility companies in spraying the public lands of the road allowances?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're well beyond that. In addition to what the scenario has been outlined by the member from Westlock Sturgeon, we're also now very actively in the process of ensuring that we have a system of licenses for applicators, and that applicators of particular chemicals, where they be a part-time person who's an employee of an agricultural service board or an employee of a local municipality, in fact do have knowledge to be able to read the labels, to apply them. There are frequent meetings and discussions throughout the province with the Agricultural Service Board on a provincial-wide basis, and our officials are available to provide any guidance that's required and necessary. It's an ongoing basis. It's very sophisticated. Recently, I had an opportunity to talk to the Industrial Vegetation Management Association of Alberta. I gave what I thought was one of my better speeches in the month of March. I'm just delighted. I looked for an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to table it here in the House, and I really want to thank the member for Glengarry for giving me that opportunity yesterday, and I would ask all members to read it, and particularly all members of the media to read it, to really understand our position with respect to this business in our province.
Supplementary question to the Minister of Agriculture, Mr. Speaker. This has to do with what information is available from the Department of Agriculture with direction from the Department of the Environment to inform the agricultural sector how these chemicals should be safely used. Has there been any program? I know there have been some programs, but how extensive have those programs been?
Mr. Speaker, we work very closely with the Department of Environment and in conjunction with Agricultural Canada, and I would just underscore what the Honourable Minister of Environment just indicated to the member from Edmonton-Glengarry. If he does have any concerns with the conduct of Agricultural Canada, we would deeply appreciate that, because to our knowledge they have always acted in a very responsible manner. As it relates to chemicals, we again work very closely with Environment, the Department of Environment, in doing our level best to communicate to the farming population some of the hazards that they could encounter in spraying various chemicals, and we refer again to 2,4-D, in which we have had communication with a number of the individuals within the farming community. We also do have some documentation that we distribute as widely as possible, but I guess it's the same as everything else. We can always do more. In any way that the honourable member could suggest for us to do more, we'd be happy to investigate.
Member for Cypress Redcliffe, supplementary.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Environment. I wonder if the Minister of Environment has any information on how much all these extensive tests have increased the price of chemicals, in that 60 miles from my hometown I can go across the American border, buy the same chemical about 2/3 or less the cost of that chemical in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I cannot definitively give a particular costing factor for a particular chemical. There are some 80,000 to 100,000 of them listed in the world, but I would like the honourable member to know that it is my view and it is my opinion that should there be a costing factor for research, that must be a requirement for the safe utilization of such a chemical, and it's certainly not my intent as the Minister of the Environment to suggest that simply because of a few dollars here and there, that we should forsake research and protection of our environment so that the user of the product might be able to use it at a cheaper rate. I think protection of our environment is much more important.
Edmonton Meadowlark, and if there's time, Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, we established that the Treasurer has a responsibility for an unfunded pension liability of $5.4 billion, which he hides in an obscure footnote to the province's balance sheet. At that time, he made a statement that his government put up $1 billion some time ago to cover that unfunded pension liability. Could the Treasurer please explain how it is that $1 billion covers $5.4 billion, or do we all have to be chartered accountants to figure out how that adds?
Check with MoMA.
Could the Treasurer, so the Treasurer is establishing that in fact he has an unfunded pension liability of $5.4 billion, which will be paid out of government revenues, tax revenues over the long term, and therefore enhances this government's debt. Second question, why has the Treasurer not complied with the Auditor General's recommendation that provinces' pension funds be evaluated every 3 years on an actuarial basis, or every year on an actuarial basis, rather than every 3 years as currently done by this government?
Now, Mr. Speaker, there's some sense in the question. We can probably provide some reasonable explanation for the way in which the policy is unfolded. First, Mr. Speaker, let me say that there is no attempt here to hide the information from the people of Alberta. In fact, on numerous occasions, we have both flagged the outstanding liability, expressed our own concern about the size of that contingent liability, But let it be very clear, Mr. Speaker, that in terms of generally agreeable ways in which the unfunded liability of pension plans can be presented, this province has followed to a T that generally accepted disclosure. It's been disclosed, Mr. Speaker, not only in the annual statements of the province, which are now being debated in the public accounts, but more recently, Mr. Speaker, as a matter of course, I filed in this tabled in this legislative assembly the 5 copies of the pension plan operations, which, for a matter of record, clearly state therein the amount of the unfunded liability. So, Mr. Speaker, first of all, let it be very clear that there is no intention nor attempt to hide any of that unfunded liability. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, make it very clear as well that this province does share the same concern about the size of that liability, have taken actions already to ensure that the increase in that liability does not continue. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, you must balance this question not just with the simple actuarial number crunching approach from the member across the way, but with the humanistic side here as well, Mr. Speaker, because of course many people are dependent upon the way in which this pension fund affects their daily lives in terms of their dependency for income on these dollars. We as a government have seen the opportunity and the need to ensure that they are protected against inflation, Mr. Speaker, and that's why, aside from any contractual responsibility which exists in the pension liability, the pension fund now, we have provided indexing of those pension plan contributions every year, contributions to the members. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we have gone essentially beyond what is required to us by us in law, provided that additional protection, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, some of those liabilities are occurring, and of course we have to deal with them. Now, Mr. Speaker,
the time for question period has expired. Might we have unanimous consent to finish this line of questioning? Opposed? Before the chair recognizes the member for Edmonton Meadowlark to continue, one must point out that under Beauchene 363, that the minister merely did not respond to the question, which is well within the accepted parliamentary practice. And therefore the member cannot assume that by a non-response that means that the minister either admitted or rejected. The second supplementary, Edmonton Meadowlark.
It is true, however, Mr. Speaker, that is the shortest response that this minister has ever given to this House. So thank you. It's also true that people do depend on those pensions long-term, and will this government be able to meet that liability long-term out of diminishing income or tax revenues to this government? Third question, what impact has the government's early retirement program had upon the government's unfunded pension liability, or did the Treasurer take the time to assess that before implementing that program?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I won't disappoint the member again. I will take some time to lay before the Assembly a very clear statement of our policy and attempt herein to bring into play the factors which we must consider in terms of developing that policy. Let's be clear that in this province, and I guess across Canada, there is a new phenomena taking place, and that is one of longevity, one to which we all subscribe, and one to which we all contribute vast amounts of money to ensure that that happens. And therefore, these plans which have been put in place, Mr. Speaker, were based on an actuarial assumption which to some extent is now obsolete, in that the facts show clearly that people are living much longer lives, and therefore, of course, the obligation of the liability, of course, becomes extended. Now, I know the member understands that, but we should show that on the record, because, of course, it is, in fact, that longevity calculation which, to a very large degree, determines the size of, in fact, this so-called undisclosed liability, or this contingent liability. And that liability continues to increase every year. What has happened, as a matter of course, Mr. Speaker, is that we have not increased the contribution levels. Now, I guess I can only read between the lines, and perhaps I'm making the same mistake that the member across the way is, that if there is concern about the size of this unfunded liability, then I'd imagine it is implicit in his question, Mr. Speaker, that in fact we should do something about it. So I'm hopeful that the member from Meadowlark will support the initiatives we take when in fact we increase the contributions by all of us, including all of those who are affected by that plan. And I'm assured that the member from Meadowlark agrees to that. And moreover, Mr. Speaker, that perhaps the member is suggesting we de-index the plan, that when inflation takes place, we do not provide any inflationary protection. That's the second element, Mr. Speaker. And finally, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the payoff matrix of benefits, I'm assuming, I can only assume since the member raises the question twice now in the last 2 weeks, that we have no alternative but to reduce and change the payoff side. And if that, in fact, is a fair set of principles and policies which we can follow, because fundamentally those are the only choices that are available to us, then, of course, I'll come forward with that kind of recommendation and look for the support of the member from Meadowlark, because it's essentially what he's saying.
It is interesting he's putting words in my mouth. In fact, what I'm saying is that if the government hadn't spent this money over the last 15 years on frivolous expenditure...
Order, please. Order, please, honourable member. The Chair and the House have extended the courtesy to extend question period. We are now 6 minutes beyond the end of question period. Could the member please ask the question? It's supplementary. It's not preamble and debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Treasurer, will the government be implementing the new Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants rules for pension and accounting, which require that the long-term liability be specified and not just a present valued $5.4 billion, which in fact is much smaller than what this government will be spending over the next 20 or 30 years on this particular pension liability?
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'd be glad to talk about present value analysis, but I don't think too many of us would like to have that various actuarial calculations presented to the Assembly. Mr. Speaker, what I will do, however, is simply say that, first of all, there has been no attempt at all, and it is in fact clearly misleading for the member to suggest there's been some frivolous tampering with the fund policy, because in fact those funds are isolated, are distinct, and the word fund itself is clear. Mr. Speaker, a fund set up under this Assembly means that it's separate from the General Revenue Fund and cannot be touched for any other purposes except the protection of the income benefits to those people who have served this province and have served under the responsibility of the academic pension plan or other pension plans which are our responsibility. So, Mr. Speaker, that point must be clear and must be clearly understood that in fact that is the case. And it is in fact misleading to suggest that this government has done anything but manage that fund with due prudence and judicious decisions. In fact, the fund has performed amazingly well, Mr. Speaker, had it not been for the investment decisions we had taken and the very high rate of return which we have garnered for these funds, that in fact the unpaid-for liability will be much larger. And let's remember, Mr. Speaker, that we did take $1 billion from the General Revenue Fund of this province and transferred it to the unsecured liability to ensure that these funds are in place. Mr. Speaker, that is a clear statement of our...
Little Bow, followed by St. Albert.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question to the Provincial Treasurer in terms of the early retirement program in that overall pension discussion that is just occurring. Could the Minister indicate what the policy is of government in dealing with those persons that are currently taking the early retirement program in hiring those people back on private contracts?
Mr. Speaker, it is in fact true that the early retirement program was referenced, and I didn't give a comprehensive response to that, and I'll take a time to do that now, with your permission, Mr. Speaker. First of all, it is what we have done with respect to the early retirement program is to not at all interrupt or change the normal benefits which flow to an individual which have been accrued as a result of service and contribution. Those are inviolate and are not changed by the early retirement program, and in fact, all we have done is enhance the short-term benefits which an individual receives upon retirement, and those short-term benefits are essentially in the form of wages. With respect to the second element, Mr. Speaker, as to whether or not there is an opportunity for re-employment within the government, and clearly, Mr. Speaker, there are clear provisions that, in fact, that cannot happen under the terms of the retirement program.
Final supplementary, St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's done such an efficient job of looking after those pensions. That's why we have a $5.6 billion unfunded.
Honourable member, order, please. The same friendly advice given to the member for Edmonton Meadowlark applies to the member for St. Albert.
I stand corrected, Mr. Speaker. Would the Provincial Treasurer please inform this Assembly and all Albertans why the 7 pension plans this government administers and guarantees do not fall under the same applied rules as applied to all other pension plans in the province as contained in Section 38(2) of the Employee Pension Plans Act, which states that pension plans must provide for funding in accordance with prescribed tests for solvency of pension plans that are adequate to provide payment of all benefits.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, there is no doubt at all, there should be no doubt in anybody's mind that the obligation of this government to the people under the pension plan is clear. And not only have we ascribed to new plans, but we have taken under the umbrella of the protection of the government additional plans. Now, the member who makes $100,000 a year over there should be clear that his contributions can be increased if he wants to increase it. Mr. Speaker, the only thing I can conclude, of course, is that the member is suggesting that we increase the contributions. Now, I hope if he makes a suggestion, in all honesty here, if he is concerned about the contribution levels clearly, then he will be one who will support it when we bring in a policy which will increase the contributions, because that's essentially what he is suggesting. The only remedy to an unfunded plan is to either increase the contributions, reduce the COLA clause or the indexing, and reduce the payoff side. That's all you can do in these plans, Mr. Speaker, and that's what, in fact, both members are suggesting, and I'll take that as advice.
Point of order, Westlock Sturgeon.
My point of order, Mr. Speaker, is under Beauchene 358. I realize that it has to do with your interpretation of whether my question followed my supplemental followed the original, Mr. Speaker. And you do an admirable job of being able to follow the ping-pong of conversation back and forward between question and answer. But I submit, Mr. Speaker, that I was asking on the corporation tax, which what the original question was about by the Leader of the Opposition, and what corporations were paying and how it affected the citizens of Alberta. Now we have on the emergency side of it, the fact that it should be answered soon, that one of the biggest corporations in Alberta, talking about being sold to one of the largest corporations in the world. There is an income tax question involved, has already been mentioned on the federal scene, and all I was asking the Treasurer, Mr. Speaker, in all the deference, is that how is the income tax question affecting the provincial government? Are there any provincial taxes owing, and will the provincial taxes that would have normally accrued be cut by the sale to a large foreign corporation?
With respect to the point of order, the Chair also would like to cite back hymn number 371 in Beauchene, which deals with supplementary questions. Although there may be no debate on an answer, further questions as may be necessary for the elucidation of the answers that have been given within due limits may be addressed to a minister. However, this is the point to be underlined. The extent to which supplementary questions may be asked is in the discretion of the Speaker. And the Chair understands some of the confusion because from time to time, as I have reviewed Hansard, members of the Assembly in all quarters have sort of come to believe the question period, you start to ask a question of a particular minister, then the range of questions can be somewhat as if it were the same as estimates and to go almost all over the map or all over the department. And so that on this point, I think the Chair appreciates the fact that Westlock Sturgeon has brought the matter up. I think it has allowed us to have this discourse in the chamber because all of us need to listen more closely as to what the original line of questioning really is about, and then we can keep the rest of the supplementaries germane to the topic. Further points of order? Member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I bring my point of order under Standing Orders, Section 23H. The Provincial Treasurer made an allegation that I make $100,000 a year. Now, for his information, I would like to inform him that I don't make $100,000 a year. As a matter of fact, I could bring my T4 slips into this Assembly, and they would show that I make less than $65,000 a year. And as a matter of fact, Mr. Provincial Treasurer, I donated over $17,000 of my MLA's salary to a certain organization, and not like some others in this House, at least I don't earn outside earnings.
Order. Order. Order, please. Order! So much for that point of order. Chair recognizes the Minister of Career Development and Employment.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to rise on a matter of privilege pursuant to Beauchene Citation 82 and give notice to this Assembly under Section 15, Subsection 2 of Standing Orders. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I was served by a member of this Assembly with legal action and within the environs of this Assembly while the Assembly was in session. In my view, this is a breach of all members' privilege, and I intend to pursue fully the matter with you, Mr. Speaker. I will provide a more detailed notice on this issue on Monday or Tuesday and provide the notice to the House leaders. This is a regrettable matter, Mr. Speaker, and I beg your indulgence.
Provincial Treasurer.
Speaker, similarly to the notice given by the Minister of Employment, Career Development and Employment, I also am a defendant in action taken by the 4 members of the Liberal Party against me, not as a Minister of the Crown, but as the Treasurer, and not as an action against the Crown, Mr. Speaker. And under a set of very clear precedents which exist both in terms of the own legislation in which we operate and in terms of the history of the parliamentary system of Canada and Britain, I will make available to you, Mr. Speaker, probably on Monday, a statement what I consider to be a serious matter on a question of privilege.
This is not a point of order. This is a point of privilege, honourable member. Chair has been given appropriate notice at the earliest possible occasion on behalf of both ministers, and with reference to Standing Order 15 subsection 2, then the necessary matters will be carried through in terms of the action, and that the written presentations will be made to the chair 2 hours prior to the opening of the House on Monday, and then matters will continue from there.